The next step I want to go through is the mechanics. How does this actually work? Because as I said, it's not a commodity that we grow, stick on a truck and send to market. Just out of interest, anyone here ever seen a carbon credit? No, I've never seen one. I've been doing it for 10 years. I've sold a lot. What we're actually selling is generally digits in an electronic registry somewhere. That's really what it is. So when it comes to the carbon farming initiative, one of the first things to understand is that it's voluntary. No one is forcing you to participate. If you can leave this presentation today in either one of two frames of mind, I'll be very happy. One of those will be, okay, I've had a look at the carbon farming initiative, there's nothing in it for me, I'm not going to spend any more time on it, I'm going to get back to working, fantastic, I've done my job. If you walk out of here and say, listen, there might be something in this, I need to investigate it further, again, fantastic, I've done my job. The idea is to give you guys a bit of an idea. I cannot compress all the information that is required into an hour and a half. It's just not possible. But hopefully I'll give you enough information to make some better decisions. As I mentioned, it's voluntary and it's bipartisan approval. Both sides of politics agree with it. Importantly, what we're looking for is complementary actions rather than competitive measures. It's not carbon or farming, it's carbon and farming. Most of the landholders here would already be carbon farmers. It is the basic building block of life. So we're looking for those actions that will prepare you for the predicted climate change. And again, whether you believe in climate change or not, doesn't really matter. Australia is a pretty bizarre country when it comes to weather. All right, we have very hot periods, very cold periods, long dry spells, wet spells, all sorts of things. So the idea is that some of the activities you can undertake, whether it's well-placed shelter belts or improving the efficiency of your cattle or your sheep or getting your production systems more refined, it's going to help you prepare for those predicted climate changes or just the weather extremes we have. It can also provide the revenue to offset the input rise costs and the costs of processing. So if you're creating carbon credits and selling them, it's going to give you additional revenue. And at the same time, it can reduce your exposure to the carbon price. If you become more efficient in your energy use, more efficient in the use of fertiliser, for example, you're going to be paying less of the carbon price. But you're also going to be creating carbon credits. And hopefully, through all this, the idea is it will also increase productivity. Apparently by 2050 we've got 9 billion people to feed on this planet. So agriculture's got to go through some fairly significant changes and some improvements and efficiencies. Okay. Now the carbon farming initiative is guided by a set of what we call integrity principles, or the government calls integrity principles. And the first two I've highlighted, additionality and permanence, are probably the hardest to get your head around and also generally the most important. Has anyone heard of additionality? Do you want to explain it? Because I have trouble. Thanks, that's very kind of you. Basically, when you're looking at additional, what we're looking for is activities that occur above and beyond business as usual. And the question you have to ask yourself is, would have I undertaken this activity if the scheme didn't exist? If there was no scheme, would I be undertaking this? The government addresses additionality through a process called what they call the positive list, which is again governed by a thing called a common practice test, which I'll explain in just a minute. So additionality, we're looking for things in above and beyond business as usual. You don't get paid for doing things that you would have done anyway. You have to find some way of changing it. A very simple concept to understand is when we're talking about carbon credits, particularly in the agricultural sector, what we're talking about is what is the change in carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions associated with that parcel of land which can be attributed to my change in management. So that's what we're really trying to get down to. So did I do this for all the right reasons, or was this something I was going to do anyway? The next one is permanence. Any activity that's undertaken has to be permanent. You have this risk of reversal in things like sequestration activities. There's two basic activities. One is abatement, where you stop emissions going into the atmosphere and stop the problem getting any worse. And the other one is sequestration, where you take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it as carbon in the vegetation and soils. And that's a sequestration project. So any activity has to be permanent. Now, if you stop a cow burping, you've stopped it. It's not that easy to go and squeeze it harder and get more burps out of it later on. Once you've stopped it, and that's a permanent abatement. You change your management practice and start putting additives into your mixed rations in a dairy herd, for example, you've done it. It's happened. You can't change it, you can't undo it later on. But if you store carbon in your vegetation or your soils, you can undo it. You can cut the trees down or plough the vegetation in, you can change your management practice of your soils and release the carbon. So there is that risk of reversal. So when it comes to sequestration activities, they have this thing called permanence, has to be permanent. And they've determined that to be permanent, means the sequestration or the carbon has to be taken out of the atmosphere and kept out for 100 years. Now that's pretty permanent to me. I'm not going to be here in 100 years. So you have to have mechanisms to ensure that occurs. And this is where a lot of the obligations, etc., come to it. So that 100 years is basically put there because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has determined that if you release a molecule of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it takes 100 years for it to either be broken down in the atmosphere or stored in the deep carbon cycle at the bottom of the oceans or deep in the terrestrial soils. So it's 100 years. The other things you have to look at are things like avoidance of leakage. You can't just force your emissions somewhere else. You can't say, what I'm going to do is take that 10 hectares of my land over there and take the cattle off it. And I'm going to save 1.5 tonnes a year because I've taken the cattle off that parcel of land, and I'm going to plant trees and I'm going to get 50 tonnes of carbon that way. But to do that, I have to go and cut down 10 hectares of trees over here and put my improved pasture over there and put my cows over there. That's leakage. You've just shifted your emissions to somewhere else. So you have to think constantly, what is the net effect on the atmosphere? What have I actually achieved? And then you have to prove it. It has to be measurable and verifiable. And as I said, it's not something we can go and pick up and put under the microscope necessarily. So you have to be able to have measurable and verifiable. So when we're talking about carbon or green credits, carbon credits, we're selling digits in an electronic registry, as I mentioned. So one of the issues we face is quite often what we're selling is either not carbon, because we're not emitting something, or we're selling stuff that's stored in someone else's property. So when you're selling air, essentially, you need to have airtight management systems. And this is where the measurement and the verifiable component comes into it, and it can be expensive. You need to be conservative, making sure the basic concept again is that you have to be certain that more carbon is stored or abated than you claim. You have to be internationally consistent because we are moving to an international trading arrangement. There is a conference of parties in Durban in 2012, I think it was, end of 2012, where all the companies or countries got together and said, we want to have an internationally binding agreement by 2015 that will be implemented by 2020. Angela Merkel from Germany was on the radio yesterday saying that doing nothing is not an option. The globe has to respond. The countries that agreed to sign up to this included America, China, India, Brazil. All the countries that have been blocking it in the past have all said, yes, we want to get in by 2015 and have the framework set out, and we will implement it by 2020. So, we'll see if that happens. I mean, I think we've been looking at the Doha free trade talks for over 40 years, but we'll see if we can get the international carbon trading arrangements up. But we are seeing a lot of domestic action, and we're starting to see it occur. And you also have to be supported by peer-reviewed science. They're the basic integrity principles. If you're thinking about how to do a carbon farming project, you have to consider those. Some of the general rules for the carbon farming initiative is that credits are created after the abatement or sequestration has occurred. You can't plant your trees and say, righto, I reckon in 50 years I'm going to have 1,000 tonnes on site, give me the credits. You actually have to go through the process of getting the credits, growing the trees, and then getting it, reporting on it and verifying it. It's very important that you understand that it takes time. The minimum reporting period is 12 months. So even if you started a project today, planted trees for example, you would have to wait 12 months before you could actually claim any carbon credits or even report on it. So it's not going to happen overnight. For a number of years I've been trying to tell farmers to get involved as soon as possible to take advantage of the high price. We know it's $23 at the moment. It's going to be $24 next year and $25 the year after. But it takes time. You can spread your reporting period out to 5 years if you wish. And the reason for that is that particularly if you're growing trees or undertaking soil carbon sequestration, you can spread out the cost of verification over 5 years worth of credits rather than one, and the price per tonne, the price of verification per tonne comes down. As I mentioned, they can be exported. And sequestrations, they have that long-term maintenance obligation. That's that permanence rule. Basically, the concept behind this is that every certificate that is issued must be backed by the same amount of carbon on site. And the reason for that is that if I create a carbon credit and I give it to a company and the company uses it to satisfy its liability under the carbon tax, and then I go and plough my paddock and get rid of the carbon, or I go and bulldoze the trees, then the credit I've sold is no longer valid. It's not backed by the carbon on site, and the integrity of the scheme starts to fall over. So you have to keep it there for 100 years. The other good thing is that carbon credits don't have an expiry date. They can be banked. So if I create a carbon credit today, I can sell it in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years' time. It doesn't matter. They don't go off. They're non-perishable goods. So they can't, you can just stick it in the shed, stick it in the bank, keep it in your account and sell it when you think the prices are right. Is everyone still with me? Because you will be tested later. There isn't a test, isn't there? Okay, continuing on this. So how do we go through all this? Well, basically, we have these things called methodologies. And methodologies are the rules and guidelines on how you actually undertake a project. What do you have to report on? How do you design your project? How do you run the calculations? What sort of information and documentation do I require to prove what I've done? Because the burden of proof is always on the project proponent or the landholder to prove everything. It's not something, as I said, we can just go and get our hands on. You can have, every different project type has different methodologies. There's a whole range of different activities that can be undertaken from growing trees to soil carbon sequestration, to fertiliser efficiency. There was even a proposal to shoot camels at one stage. And each of those different activities has a different methodology, and each methodology has different baseline requirements, different setup requirements, different reporting requirements, and different monitoring and verification requirements. So if you're on a property and you're running, say, a soil carbon, you've got some windbreaks you've chucked in, you've got some sequestration going there, you've changed the enteric fermentation of your cattle, they are all different projects and would all need to be reported on differently. The other thing is that you must meet all regional natural resource management plans. So the local CMA will be required to say, well, yes, it does fit in, or it's not inconsistent with our plans. So you can't go and do things like plant weed species and claim carbon sequestration. And you also have to meet all other statutory plans. And there has been incidences where carbon farming projects have been rejected because they didn't meet the council plans. Sequestration projects also require the notification of consent of all parties with a vested interest in the land. Now there's a couple of pretty big groups out there, not so much in South Australia, but certainly other parts of Australia, but there is one very big group that will want to know what you're doing. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to who that might be? The banks. The banks are going to have to sign off. If your property is mortgaged, the bank will want to know. I'm talking to a couple of banks at the moment about this. They want to know two things. One, what does it do to your capacity to repay the loan? And two, what does it do to the value of my property? Your property. So that's definitely what they want to know. And you have to get that signed off. You also have to put a notification of consent on land title. The other one on the notification of consent of all land parties is leasehold land. If it's leasehold land, ultimately the government owns it and they will need to sign off on it. And they will look at how long the lease runs for, what's your obligations past, because you've got to keep it there for 100 years, particularly with sequestration. And you also have to put a notification on project on land title, so that because it's a 100-year rule, this is all coming from that permanence requirement. Because it's the 100-year rule, as we call permanence, the chances are someone else will own your property before the project's ended. So they have to be aware of it and they have to be able to make their decision about, well, is it a good idea to have this project? What's the maintenance obligation? They'll need to know about it. Whether you pass it on to your daughters or your sons or someone else buys it, at some point it has to be there so people know that it's there. The other thing is the government keeps a risk of reversal buffer. Because of sequestration projects, you have that potential to reverse the situation and release the carbon back into the atmosphere. The government, in their good grace, will keep 5% of all credits created to create basically a industry-wide insurance scheme. And that gives us some good opportunities later on, particularly in repatriation after depletion events such as fire, etc. So I'll get to that a bit later. So what's eligible? And the basic eligibility requirement of the Carbon Farming Initiative are those 4 points there. You have to be within the scope of the Carbon Farming Initiative, which includes most land-based activities. They are described in a document called the CFI regulations. You need to be on this thing called the positive list, and you can't be on the negative list. And you have to have an approved methodology. Generally at this stage, early stages, once you get down to stage 4 and an approved methodology, you're pretty safe on all the other ones. But the positive and negative list are very interesting. The positive list is how the government is tackling additionality. The positive list is basically a dynamic list of projects that are automatically qualified for additionality. So things like planting permanent environmental plantings is considered additional. You don't have to go through the process of proving additionality. You can lobby the government to have things put on and taken off the positive list. The positive list is governed by this thing called a common practice test. And the common practice test is looking at, is it above and beyond business as usual? Would this have occurred in the absence of the scheme? And it's also trying not to perversely punish early movers. What they look at is this a common practice in this subgroup or this region or this industry group? and they try to compare apples with apples, because what happens up in the northern beef herd is not necessarily the same as what happens in the southern beef herd. And a classic example of this is in over near Geraldton in Western Australia. They do a lot of subsurface soluble nitrogen fertilisation in gutless white sands. That's pretty common practice over there. Very uncommon in Western New South Wales. So if you were undertaking that activity in Geraldton, you wouldn't get carbon credits because it's common practice. You're doing it in Western New South Wales, it's not common practice, and you probably would get carbon credits for it. But it opens up a very interesting conundrum, because at some point, everyone's going to go, this is a really good thing, I'm into it. And all of a sudden, everybody's doing it. And it's no longer under 5%, it's now common practice. So technically, it comes off the positive list. So they manage that in a way by using things called crediting periods. And crediting periods are basically a guarantee from the government that when you undertake a project, you will be given a set number of years that it will be eligible no matter what. So for example, permanent environmental plantings, I think it's 15 years. So you start a project, you know that you're going to be able to run it under those rules for 15 years. And the crediting periods vary. They're talking about changing the regulations to put landfill out to 100 years. They're talking about putting fertiliser efficiency and things like that might be 3 to 5 years. The thing is though, if we do get to a point where everybody's doing it and they take it off the positive list and all of a sudden everybody stops doing it, then clearly it was only occurring because of the scheme and it'll go back onto the positive list. They also have a much, much bigger list of projects that are automatically disqualified from undertaking activities. For example, you can't be a managed investment scheme. Right? They're not allowed. You can't go and plant weed trees in known weed species and claim carbon sequestration. The negative list is about stopping perverse economic, social or environmental outcomes. So in these situations, for example, there's a whole range of activities you can't do or you're prevented from doing. So you can't go and plant, if you go and put a full harvest plantation in an over 600 millimetre of rainfall, you either have to have a water right equivalent to the uptake of the trees or approval to undertake the project, basically saying that you're not pinching water from downstream users. So they've tried to address some of the issues, and a bit of experience we've had in the blue gum industry. The other, one of the other ones is you can't do what they call prescribed tree plantings, which is doing street trees, planting trees in racecourses, schoolyards, hospitals, cemeteries, and a whole range of other things. So they have this dynamic list, and you can go and find it, and things will come on and off that list. They're actually at the process of putting some new things on the positive list as well, things like avoided deforestation.